pros, there's never been a
clicked
council
it, yep.
that doesn't have an attorney on it. And like
It says
people
recording.
tackle this last one. Maybe, but some real
Good afternoon, everyone.
people,
Welcome to our March 14th session for the Supported Market Work Group. This group is going to be taking a look at several different things. And let me get my notes up and running. Sorry, we were a little late getting started, but we are here now and raring to go. And we have our agenda. All right, so I had sent out a bunch of information which talks a lot about RSA 79E and some of the tools around that, also some of the stuff around the housing commissions and revolving funds, and also stuff about up and coming legislation that will do housing opportunity zones. So those are just some of the things that I would like us to start to formulate and put into a framework that allows us to move forward. One of the things being that we do actually have an approved housing committee that was formed many years ago and created the housing policy that now directs us, but it hasn't had any members on it or actually doing anything. So I kind of think we should have a conversation about that as to whether or not that should be a committee that does indeed get formed and or has members appointed to it, and what that would look at. And so I think some of the recommendations that we can make to the city will be part of that. With that said, the other thing that I would like to have someone offer, hopefully to help me with some research for this group, is looking at the governors of New Hampshire's want to give $100 million to the state for housing needs. And I think that we could really take a look at whether or not we could get any money into the housing fund that we actually do have, but has no money in it, because that would also help us. So those are some of the things that I want us to continue to look at. And I would be curious about anyone else's ideas around whether or not we feel like 79E is something we could use. Obviously it takes having those sort of rundown buildings in order to put that together. So I think that having a conversation around that would be one of our first topics. What do you think?
So one question, 79E seems to focus pretty heavily on downtown. And so how much opportunity is there downtown versus the rest of Portsmouth? So I'm wondering how broadly applicable the recommendations would be for Portsmouth.
It does focus on it, but it doesn't mean you can't designate other areas
Okay.
to be part of it. And there could be, like, we're trying to create these little sort of pockets outside of the city, which was part of our gateway. So my thought is that we could really, it does sort of seem to focus on that, but I don't think anything's preventing us from taking a look at it in a larger level.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
I like to think of an example, a totally underutilized section of the city somewhere that we could create up and around it. I don't know if we actually have those or not, but it's one of the things that I thought we should be taking a look at. Other questions, input?
About the governor's $100 million pledge, I definitely would commit to working with our local representatives, elected representatives, to figure out and stay really abreast to that topic.
Thank you.
Mesh really well with the legislative committee too, and I think it would be a
Right.
good thing to
Right.
kind of utilize, especially as we're looking at some of these RSAs and how we may be able to use them in the city.
Right, so if you can get the information on that and try to come back to us with what that would be good, that would be great. There's one of our first objectives.
I would just like to second that. I think that it's important that we hold the governor and his team accountable for the fact that there's $100 million that's sitting on the table without a framework or anything about how to get it out. I think it's an important pot of money, and it's that's been consistent with other relief funds that have come down the pike, and he really needs to create that framework. And I think by putting some pressure on and asking for it for some real things, that's going to be important.
Yeah, I know it was a very sort of generally put out there as far as the areas that they were willing to support, but no framework as to how you apply for it, get it, what you have to do, so.
Or what AMI groups might be targeted by that funding. That's always interesting to me, like who's going to be.
marketed.
I think the State of the State address is this week as well. Do we
It's
expect-
tomorrow morning.
Do we expect him to have any?
I don't know, but I'll be
guidelines?
listening.
Okay.
I will be listening. Yes, it is 8:30 tomorrow morning on Zoom. Yep. Group and framework. Anyone else have any questions about what was sent out or?
So for 79E, the enabling legislation, so thank you for the framework around how to get to enabling legislation. Any thoughts on whether it would need to be a ballot initiative or something put forward by the council?
The council can vote to allow us to do it, right? So it does take a council vote. It doesn't take a ballot vote.
Okay.
We are, because of our form of government, the council can initiate it. Yeah. So it could be one of our recommendations that we want them to initiate, see how it was formed. So we've invested some research in looking at our city and looking at this legislation, and we think that we could create some targeted zones for this specific project, for this, and therefore, we would then recommend to the city council that they do that.
Okay, would the enabling legislation precede the establishment of the zones, or do you go forward with the, here's where we think this could be most impactful, and then we?
I think you can do it simultaneously, but I
Okay.
could look into that a little bit more. It's my vision is that we would ask them to do that, and as part of that, we recommend where we think that would be
Okay.
best, utilized, shall we say.
And
Not
I-
finding my words today.
And I think prioritizing the downtown housing over the other public benefits might also be important as well. If they're all equally weighted, then you'd be hard pressed to find a project in a downtown or revitalization area that wouldn't impact economic vitality. So if there's a decision-making framework or something that could be recommended for how to approve a project, I think that should also be part of the recommendations.
Which I think in the housing plan that former Councilor Rebecca had put up, it is listed that if you're weighing the options for some of the permitting and all of that stuff, to lean towards the side of housing.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's our housing policy that I
Policy,
handed
yes.
out the last time, yeah. Well, because one of the other discussions and I'm talking broader, not today, but is to look at that policy and see whether or not any updates need to be made to it as well. But I think if you guys can help, look at different parts of the city and figure out where in the city we are going to, could possibly use 79E, I think that would be, I'm not sure, and that was a question I had talking to somebody else. They're like, I said, I would love to be able to enact 79E and use it. Exeter has done a really good job at it, and I actually have talked to Darren there a few times, and he has he's very good at explaining. So if you guys wanted him to come and speak to this group about that specifically, I could have him, he's already willing to come and talk to us, so I just have to set that up.
And I can also work with Nancy Carmer from the EDC to see if we've had any requests or applications for this as well, so I can bring that back for our next working meeting.
Right, I kind of wish this had been in place before the brewery buildings got done, because that would have been a perfect area, right? That
Yeah.
whole West End would have been a great place to have done something like that, so, too little, too late, what can I say? But that's, yeah. Anything else about that? Not to rush people along, but. Questions, other ideas? If not, I will move on to talking about, and I will actually rely on our assistant mayor to help me out because she sits on the legislative committee about what's going on with the housing opportunity zones, the community tool belt, and all of those. I don't know how much you guys have talked about that.
We haven't fully really started diving too much into them, but we have lightly discussed them, especially with the changing of the city manager bringing up the expanded economic revitalization zones and expanding them of kind of what we can do. Mostly with the legislative committee, we have been real, and this also plays with House, and we've been really focusing on making sure that we are supporting municipalities in what they're doing, because a lot of stuff at the legislative level is removing some of those things, including a big part that I think affects this committee too, is the Airbnb statute that is going forward, that we really believe will cause more of a housing crisis If you can get $300 a night for an apartment that you maybe get $2,000 a month, those numbers are really easy to commute to how it could affect our, we're finding some pushback from other communities, obviously, that, aren't as tourist driven, and so they don't see the same fears that we see. But there are communities like us, Lincoln, North Conway, Hampton, that are really kind of pushed together, and really pushing it as a housing issue, that this is going to just exacerbate the issue that we already have.
Yeah, I agree on the short-term rentals. I think it's disastrous for us if it gets
Yeah.
blanketly that we can't prevent it from being anywhere, right? Or
Yeah.
we've got to at least be able to regulate it in some way that makes meaningful, positive change. It's not that we don't want it, it's just they've never given us enabling legislation to deal with it. That's
Exactly.
our larger problem, which is why it has never been dealt with. And then the second coin to that is, well, okay, now we're just going to tell you statewide you have to. Oh,
And there's the conversation, obviously, that we have what we call like a shadow community of Airbnbs that aren't heavily regulated in here, and the ones that have been have really been due to, like, say, neighborhood complaints and stuff like that. So, trying to express to the state that we are not against Airbnbs, we are not against that. How do you tax somebody on a commercial use when it's deemed a residential use? So there's conversations of that. How do you regulate it the same way you regulate Airbnbs B&Bs, not Airbnbs, just bed and breakfast. And really, our standpoint as a legislative committee and as the mayor has spoken is, again, we're not against them. It's just we really want them to be able to enact regulations on the municipal side and owner occupancy and things like that.
Yeah, no, because it's really what it's doing is it's taking the residential side of a residential neighborhood and turning it into a business. It's turning
Correct,
it into a
commercial,
commercial
yeah.
district.
Yeah.
And that's totally against the whole idea of what a residential zone is all about in my mind. So I'm somewhat very much against short-term rentals. They do ruin the fabric of a neighborhood. That's a really large concern of mine, is that it totally, people who are on vacation don't stay at the house, don't participate in the neighborhood like people that live there long-term.
Yeah, and you have
No investment.
pros and cons to it, and just figuring out how we balance it.
Is there any contrarian view on that about, is there anybody saying that it doesn't actually impact affordability or anything like that? It seems obvious, but I'm not an economist, and so
Let's look at the economic person.
Yeah, so I think this came up in an EDC meeting where we don't have any studies specific to Airbnbs. I believe that anything that's authorized to operate as an Airbnb is doing so under a bed and breakfast license. But as far as economic impact to neighborhoods, because it's covered under that B&B umbrella, we don't have any studies, at least for Portsmouth specifically, that target it.
Yeah, the bigger problem is the fact the affordability of housing is, as a long-term housing, right? Anyone that wants to actually live and work in this area has a hard time finding a place to live because there's so many rentals that go to short-term versus long-term.
And I know in the EDC and in the legislative committee, we've used North Conway as a good example, that larger chains like Marriott are actually coming in and buying single-family homes and apartment buildings and turning them into corporately run Airbnbs. And so the concern is that we are obviously a very desirable area. There was conversation of, I think in the legislative committee, that we haven't really heard, and wonder if we will hear from hotel lobbyists against this, because it has a direct correlation to them. And obviously we have a lot of hotel rooms here and a lot in the Seacoast, and how that could potentially affect them.
Yeah, I don't think there's been, I know this question's been asked at the chamber level many times, and there's never been really, there hasn't been a concern, shall we say, from the hotels side of things. But I think with your talk about North Conway, I mean, that would be disastrous if they came in and bought up an entire section of like a neighborhood and started running it as a corporate business through that. I mean, that's just
To be vacant probably a good percentage of the year because they
Right.
can still recoup return on it. Do we have a hotel occupancy tax in the state of New Hampshire? I'm sorry, being new, I'm not sure if we do.
There is on the state level, there's been a fight for, the wording has changed over the years. It used to be called the pillow tax. Now people are trying to change the wording to just a fee. That
We have a rooms
municipal-
and meals tax.
Yes, that the municipalities could, much like other cities, you could have a town or a city tax. We do not have that in the state of New Hampshire. It's been brought up and tabled and changed in the legislation for the last, I would say, at least 10 years that I've been following it. You get a lot of pushback from smaller communities that, I don't want to say don't understand, but I think don't understand the impact that we have in the cost of our services that we have to provide and the increased number of fire and police and the toll it takes on our roads and things. But we've definitely seen a huge pushback from, call it the North Country, that I think sometimes think towns on the seacoast and on the water are, like we say, paved in gold. So we do not have, there is a state one, it goes into rooms, meals and tax, and then that is divvied up, not by the amount that you bring in, but by a formula.
Population.
Yeah. So we bring in a lot more, but say, I think it's dairy.
Dairy has a much higher population, so they get more out of all the money that's generated from our community. Yeah. And this has been a fight that's been going on between municipalities and the state for a long time. So it's not a short fight.
I don't
We've made some headway. There's
Yeah.
been increases. We are getting back a little bit more.
I think
Maybe
the-
not all we asked, but
From my conversations with the mayor when we've talked about this, I think the mayor's roundtable, something that was formed during COVID, but they've kept going, has really kind of helped change some of the views and in that. But it has definitely been a struggle. I think they're trying to rebrand it again, going from the pillow tax to an imposed fee that you much like everything in the state, you can or cannot accept as a municipality. So we're getting, I think, inches closer, but. There's no doubt, I think, in anyone's mind that a fee for overnight stay, 1-2%, would change the game here in Portsmouth. And it's a common thing around the world. You go to Boston, you pay the state fee, and then you pay a city fee. You go, I was in Savannah, you pay the state fee, and then there's a city fee.
there's taxes on everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that this came up in the EDC as part of our advocacy for getting more revenue back from that. And the proposal to have $1 a night pillow tax was also soundly rejected because of a lack of interest in anybody in Concord in wanting to impose another tax, regardless of how small it is. If it's a tax, it's generally going to be seen as unpopular. So there wasn't a lot of support for that approach, where the municipalities that generate that $1 a night pillow tax would then get that back directly.
It's interesting because that's a tax to visitors, not to voting residents.
Yep.
So it's
Right.
usually, every state usually has it because it doesn't.
Any form
yeah.
of tax is generally unpopular.
Understood.
It's hard to build a coalition of legislators when you're working on something that only impacts a smaller number of towns, with so many
Right.
it's just
Well, and I think,
notoriously hard to do
I
that.
think there's a fair amount of people in the state of New Hampshire who like to visit Portsmouth, so they would definitely be against if you visit up to the lakes because you go skiing or whatnot. You're not going to want to pay that tax as a resident of the state, and therefore that's why it gets shot down quite often.
Understood.
Pipe dream. We're still dreaming it.
All right,
Still
moving
working
on, back to housing. Going to refocus everyone here.
Whatever did get passed, it could be, and because I've seen it very narrowly construed as really just something has to be returned back to generating tourism, and for Washington and Texas, that's the case.
Right.
But if it could be construed to be a tool for, if there is going to be legislation that continues to support Airbnbs, those would typically fall under that umbrella if there was a tax. And then that funding could be returned back for the purpose of affordable housing. It's just a thought because it sounds like it hasn't been successful. But maybe under that, because it sounds like New Hampshire has interpreted the use of that tax more broadly than other states I've worked in, where it's been very narrowly had to be refocused on heads and beds.
And that was one of the advocacy initiatives for that pillow tax, was for the money to come back to either marketing and tourism or affordable housing support or something, to support the communities as a result of the increased visitor traffic.
Sorry.
All right, that's all right. I just want to move the conversation to the other topic that I sent out, which was housing commissions. I'd like us to take a deep dive into feeling like, and I don't know anyone's initial opinions just from what we have read or the handbook that I got all of this stuff online, so it's all readily available at different websites. As far as whether or not sort of pulling up that housing commission is worthwhile. It's statutorily already sort of created. We are one of the few that's supposed to have one under RSA 674-44H. I think, especially with a master plan coming up, this could be something that, because one of the things that a housing commission should do is to provide advice to the planning board, who is the board that actually, finalizes and reviews all the master plans. So I think we should take a deep discussion onto whether or not we should look into statutorily putting together a housing commission to be able to take a look at that. And maybe that's something that gets put together later this year and functions most of next year, to gather up what input, whatever, public sessions, whatever the case may be, to get the idea of where maybe the master plan moves forward. But I was curious as to your thoughts about that.
Did and I apologize for not looking this up ahead of time, did Portsmouth ever have an active housing commission?
Yes, we
Okay.
did. It was formed, and what the outcome of that was the housing policy that I
Yes.
sent out. And the end result of that housing policy was the gateway districts that we now have in our corridors.
And it was dissolved after the development of the policy? Like, what's the history of why it wasn't?
I think it was because there was such a change at leadership that nobody put anybody on it or
Okay.
brought it forward due to, it was a matter of, I think that's, it just,
I think it was a passion project of a few counselors, and when those counselors were
Moved
no
on.
longer on, then other passion projects, as we put them.
there was no passion from anyone to keep it going, let's put it that way.
I think
So it's a matter of just reactivating something that has
Correct.
already existed.
Of reaching-
And how was the membership comprised? Was it mayor appointment? Was it representatives from different organizations?
It's mayor appointment.
Okay.
Yeah, it's mayor appointment, and it can, as far as this goes, it's formulated by members of different. It must have at least 3, but not more than 7 members comprised of local residents. It can also have up to 5 alternates. 1 or more members of a housing commission may also serve on the other municipal boards and commissions. So it can be made up of residents either from like planning board and other committees, or straight out residents. It's sort of it can be an application process just like any of the other commissions that we have.
I would say I would support us bringing it to the council and to the mayor, to bring that back. I think you make a good point with the master plan, and then I think with this committee, there's only so many scopes that we can adequately handle, and I think it does make sense. And it did do good work, obviously, when the
Can we talk a little bit about what their charge is exactly? Is it policy recommendations? Is it recommendations for implementing the master plan more fully? Would they chime in on regulatory changes that are before the board? I'm just trying to understand their scope and their advocacy role, because I think it'd be really great to have a group that understands the data and is in.
They're advisory,
Okay.
for sure. But it could be the scope, and we could, as a city, I think it has the whole thing laid out in the statute, and I won't read the whole statute. But it can assist the planning board. It can be like a subgroup of the planning board mixed with residents that actually take a look at these things on a side note. So, but yeah, I mean, there's a whole list of things that they can do. They can promote, enhance, encourage the development of housing. They can coordinate activities around housing. They have a pretty broad range between policy. They're not actually the implementers of probably putting the nuts and bolts language together, which would be done at the planning board level, but this would sort of gather all that policy information and direction and probably start at our last master plan and then review from there and take it into that next sort of phase where the planning board then puts it into actual words that end up in the actual
I see it
forward-thinking
as-
plan.
because we've now established, councilors established this committee, almost like a leeway between plan and board and this committee, as, this committee potentially, obviously not winds down, we're far away from that, but, you know,
We have
comes,
other things we can do, but I want to make sure we
Yeah.
sort of give our job is to recommend to the city council, right?
Yes.
So we want to be able to take all the information we have, and I don't say we're making this decision today, but I would like everybody's input on it, and then the next time the land use committee as a whole gets together, we would make these suggestions that get put forward to the city council. So thinking about this, and maybe do we want to add more framework to it? I can do a little more deep dive reading into exactly what that framework might look like, because they don't have regulatory authority, they don't have power of eminent domain, and they have their limited authority is to housing, right? And it's sort of a narrow, and obviously the master plan's more than just housing, right? It has a lot of other things, but it would be, if housing is a crisis that we all know it is, it might be important to have that group looking specifically at that piece.
So I don't want to cross-pollinate the two subcommittees, but I'm just imagining sort of like, so there will be packages of regulatory amendments that are coming out of the land use committee. I just want to understand the sequence, because it does make sense, but I'm just trying to.
We don't send amendments, we send recommendations, so it doesn't have to be, that would be, on the regulatory side, right?
Yes.
We're gonna
So
make
there'll be
suggestions.
some recommendations about amendments that are coming. The city council would say, go forth, develop those.
They'll actually go, what they'll do is they'll then say, great, we want to send that to the planning board, and we want them to report back to us as
Okay.
to their thoughts on this. And they have a public hearing and they do their process, and then they go to city council where we also have a public
So
process.
where would the housing board fit into that sequence? Just trying to make sure I understand.
Yep, no, it would fit into more of the policy side of things. So it would actually look at strictly just housing policies. And in my mind, and bringing it back in the time frame that we're talking about, it would specifically try to give us a policy piece for housing for our master plan.
Understood.
Yeah, that would be my thoughts anyways. I'm open to other people's thoughts. I'm not the only brain sitting in this room.
Yeah, could I add, back, you had read a couple of them, but on page 3 of the statute, that 67444, the powers of the Housing Commission, would just like to, in my role, and point out that we do have a public housing authority
Right.
here in Portsmouth. We were created by the city, and we don't do any policy-related, I can see opportunities to do some advocacy depending on what it is, but we don't create policies or look at policies. We did have a board member who was on the committee, or the commission, I don't know, that Senator Perkins had put together, so we were a part of that. But if you look under powers, I would suggest that there's a lot of these that if there is a commission formed, that you would be explicit that who's going to do what. Because if you see, conducting a housing needs assessment, we're doing that right
Right.
now, kind of for the city, but also for us. We are doing advocacy stuff. We are holding meetings, and this goes on to say that the commission may acquire property in the name of the town or city, subject to approval by the local governing body. So that's something that we are interested in doing also. If there's if there's a way that the city, this is helpful in a way that the city could take title to a property and lease it to the housing authority, or some mechanism like that, then I can see that would be helpful. But I would just make sure that we're not, would hate for a commission to try to acquire a piece of property that the housing authority is trying to acquire at the same time.
Right. And I don't think that would be the case. I think they would more have the policy, create the policy, so if we ever actually do fund the Housing Trust Fund, they could actually be the policy that makes recommendations to City Council about how to best utilize those
Right.
funds, right? That's sort of how I see it sort of.
I think that we should, in the next larger meeting we have, we should qualify our recommendation around reactivating this commission to focus on policy and remove the fiduciary items that are in
Okay.
44-I, at least initially, and then determine where that might lie. I don't, it's a big mandate as written in the powers here, and I don't think it makes sense, to your point, to spin up a commission that has some overlap when we haven't taken the time to think about how those interrelate.
Right.
If I could add to that, I think some things that I see, like gaps that could potentially be filled by that, and I think they could be a very good, a strong recommending board for the, or committee for the planning board, but I think that within the framework of topics just discussed, they could make recommendations for the sort of housing trust fund, should we have funding there. I also think that we have a first-time homebuyers program that we have not, I don't know that has, I think there's a trust that's there for the first-time homebuyers, and that could be something they could recruit and help support recommendations for that, because I don't know that that's actively promoted as much as we could be. And then I also think that we are talking on the regulatory side of the house about fee in lieu opportunities once the incentives have been retooled and potentially elevated to make housing, affordable housing, the highest priority incentive, and we start to see there may be opportunities that we might want to explore about fee in lieu, paying a fee in lieu of providing available housing. That typically can be a good tool for 50 and below AMI, and it could supplement housing trust fund funding as part of a larger capital package that could result in some redevelopment. So these are all things that it's always been difficult from a planner's perspective about if a developer wants to use a fee in lieu rather than provide affordable housing, when you might want to pull that trigger. There are pros and cons to that, and so really helping to make recommendations there would be very helpful, I think. And then where we have questions about data collection and things of that nature, they'd be helpful as well.
I think in the meantime, this group could actually take on the fee in lieu aspect of that question and
think
take
so,
a
too.
look at that, because it can go hand in hand with the regulatory
It is the
things that we
connection.
could look at.
It
in
is the
other group.
connection between the two groups, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
And has that been, we studied whether or not there required some enabling legislation to do that?
I have to
We had-
check with the legal department on it,
We
yeah.
had checked into that years ago when we were starting our Court Street project, and I believe the answer was there was not, but I could be wrong about that.
It's an incentive, so there's no requirement that they do it. It would be a voluntary, and so if you choose to get that density bonus that you would get, maybe the extra floor, whatever that looks like, to
right.
get that, so that to provide affordable housing, to get that extra density, it would be a choice. So it's not an impact fee, and it's not a requirement. It is a choice that they would make in lieu of the obligation that they would be to provide affordable housing to get the density they're seeking.
Right, right. I will
That
check,
seems-
I'll check with the city attorney just to make sure, because we like to cover our bases. Of course, yeah. Before we go too far down the road.
I
I
know
have
we
made
can't have
myself a
any
note.
mandatory sort of inclusionary housing, and that's where, but,
If it's their choice,
Yeah.
you can do item A, item B. You can give us 20%, you can give us whatever that dollar
Exactly.
equivalent, well, negotiate a dollar value, I guess, but yeah, we can certainly ask and figure that one out. All right, anything else? I think that was most of what I wanted to.
I think the last thing is that the establishment of the Housing Commission would also give the opportunity for residential participation and input, which we heard pretty clearly in our last meeting was important. So
Yep.
I think that's another benefit of reactivating that commission.
I agree. I think I'll take a stab at putting together a framework of what we might want to take a look at and see. I'll send it out to you guys, and you can give me feedback for it before the next meeting. I can't guarantee it'll happen this week, but I will do my best to take a stab at that. All right. So we have goals of looking at 79E a little bit further, and if you guys could all just reach out and do a little sort of fact-finding of your own as far as whether or not you see any areas of the city that might be a good place to do that. The other thing I haven't had a chance to do yet, but I'm going to, is get a list of city-owned properties. I have to make myself notes. And once we have a list of city-owned properties, that might also go into housing 79E, not specifically for us, but if there was a piece of property that would be a good fit for, maybe we put it on the market and we sell it and use that money towards other affordable housing. I'm just making this all up. I have no idea if this is possible. We need to take a look at it all.
sometimes it's offered at, like a 100-year lease for a certain amount as an incentive, and then you do a request for proposals, and then you potentially get some, you know this process, I think you've probably seen this before, I've seen that before, where there's different nonprofits that come forward, and they, with the utilization of multiple sources, including federal tax credits, they're able to potentially develop a project, but
Right.
that's one way I've seen it used, not just the sale, but then also it can itself be an incentive.
Excellent. Any other questions on that? So I was going over our goals, right? So 79E, we're going to look into whether or not there's any areas that people feel, and this is, I know, a longer conversation than just one meeting, but if you can get together, whether or not you have any specific areas that you might find that would work. You're going to work on the $100 million one. And we also have, next one was going to be
The Housing Committee.
Housing Commission, thank you.
Commission recommendation, and then fee in lieu research.
And fee and lieu research. All right. I think we have our next steps in order. Anything else you guys want to bring before we open it up to public?
I think regular meeting cadence, I know you had a challenge
I
getting this
know.
all together, but what are
Yeah.
you thinking as far as frequency, timing, just to plan ahead? I know you've got, this is not your only meeting.
It is not. I have several. I have been trying to figure that out. What is a standing? I'd like to have a standing morning once a month for land use, if we could. It's just so many people I have to talk to actually figure that out and get it into our schedule. Do you all, what would be your preference, like, of week and day of the week, if you were to have another have a standard meeting that this met? Come on.
I don't
Anyone?
have much of a preference.
Not Tuesdays or Wednesdays.
Okay.
This time works nicely,
This time was good for me as well.
yeah.
Yeah,
And not first thing Monday mornings.
and not first thing, the first Friday.
So like Wednesday mornings.
Would prefer not to do a Wednesday
So
morning.
maybe Monday,
Monday,
Lunchtime
does Monday
hour.
afternoons work? I mean, I feel like they work.
I just know for the whole committee, some of them aren't gonna, I'll have to ask Corey. I know Rick could probably do middle of the day. I don't know about Corey. Rich could probably do. So if I can check in with Corey and he thought he could do a new
Okay.
time, let me find out from him. Not Tuesdays.
or just Friday,
Thursdays.
like second Friday morning, does that work?
I was gonna say, when does the EDC?
EDC is first
First
Friday.
Friday.
It's the first Friday, okay. Because the second and third weeks of the month are always very busy first. Well, the second is because of, so you're the first, you said the second Friday?
We're the first Friday
First Friday.
every month,
And I'm looking at a calendar and I still can't remember.
7:30 to 9, but if it was a 9, then we'd already be here.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, so you're saying like the first Friday, if we did first Fridays
it would
trying
have to
to
be
9 a.m.?
Yeah, I'm trying to just.
What do you guys think about the first Friday of the month at 9 a.m.?
I think Fridays are usually a pretty low-key day for me.
Okay. So first Friday, and you guys are done by 9?
We will be done, but
If you block the room off at 9, we have to be done by 9.
That works better for you, I think, in some ways.
Yeah.
So let me see if we can get in for April 1st.
Perfect.
That will actually be technically before the regulatory committee meeting gets started. So do you guys want a little bit more time in there, and we wouldn't start then till May for the back to regular meetings? That would make it May 6th. Oh, and there's a housing talk at 9 a.m. that morning.
I guess maybe you could just do a poll and we could plan for
For-
mid-April at the earliest for our next get-together, and we'll figure out the right time.
Okay, yeah,
Because May's a
It's-
crazy month for us too. You have
it's
to.
budget month.
Yeah,
and so
we-
May is kind
I
of
think
a
we have
nightmare.
11. I think we have 11 or 12.
I don't know, before we even took office, we had 9 meetings in May scheduled,
Yep.
so I'm like, it's a crazy, crazy month. So there's probably 11 or 12 or 13 at this point.
And then I'm trying to figure out when our next legislative committee is, but it's not listed in my calendar.
Yeah. All right, so let's take a look at that. I will look at Fridays, and maybe it has to be like the third week of the month or something like that. If that it's sort of any Friday morning, 9 a.m. would work for most everyone
Not
here.
the second, it's usually planning board packets, and I have to get those out, so, but any other Friday is fine.
So the 3rd would work.
First,
'Cause
third,
I hate doing the 3rd because then it makes it the morning after a planning board meeting.
Yeah,
Which is hard on me.
and all of us.
I would definitely say I feel like the idea of the first after the
The
EDC
first
tends
after the
to.
EDC. All right, let's see if we can't get that scheduled. I will talk to the parties at B and we'll figure that out. All right, does everyone feel like they have their next steps in
Yeah.
order?
Yeah, to do public comment.
And so then, do we have any members of the public that would like to speak?
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
I also am very busy trying to keep up with all the development going on in town.
All of the information that you emailed me has been supplied to all the land use board members too,
Lovely.
or land use committee, yeah,
I have more
committee
than-
members.
I thought there were like 9 people in this group.
Well, this is half the group, right? This is the supported market side. The regulatory committee is going to be meeting early April.
All right,
That
I don't know
side.
if that'll be relevant for them. All right, I'll sit here because that's where I am sitting. All right. So my name is Elizabeth Bratter, property owner of 159 McDonough Street. One of the things we talked about at the last meeting was zoning. And to me, one of the biggest problems I see is there's a lot of double dipping allowed in our zoning for developers. And at least that's how I understand it. The zoning experts are not here at the moment, or they could be here. One of the things I want to remind you of is the sustainability objectives should be included when we develop anything in Portsmouth. Portsmouth is becoming a wall-to-wall city with lots of large developments, including housing, and we need to remember that that lack of green is going to be a problem later on that we're not going to be able to undo once a building's there. It's hard to tell somebody to take down a building to put in a green space. It's much easier to say, let's move a parking lot underground. So
Yeah, this
that's one.
seems to be more, this would be geared towards the regulatory group, because they're the ones that are going to be actually looking at our zoning and
Oh,
how
okay.
we should
I
change
didn't know
it.
we have 2 groups.
Yeah,
Okay.
well, if you remember for our first meeting, we split into sort of the regulatory side of it to really take a look at the zoning and
Okay.
figure out. And then this group is the supported market, so we're looking at sort of the more the policy side. I'd like to
Okay.
sort of think of it. It's looking at the overall policy of housing and the direction it's going, and how can we, through legislative and other means, do that.
Okay.
So,
So should I save this, or do you want me to finish?
you can finish if you'd like, or we could save it, because let's see.
When do they meet? then?
They are.
It's very hard to find in any
It's
of-
going to meet at 8:30 a.m. on Friday, April 1st, if.
Yes,
Yeah.
that works.
Okay, excellent. Says, I was just waiting for one more person to answer me before I put it. I booked the room
Is
and
it
everything.
here 8:30? Our
I-
EDC is until 9.
Oh, okay. So I will have to. That's one of the changes that might happen. I was waiting to
Sorry,
hear from.
I'm sorry.
No, that's
Yep,
all right.
That works for me.
I will. It might have to happen at 9 a.m. Let me reach out to the group, and but I will. Yeah, I didn't realize. See, but that's the second Friday. The first Friday is April 1st.
Right, you said April 1st, or did you say?
I said April 8th.
Okay.
Oh.
I thought you said the 1st.
I thought
Did
she
I?
said.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm mentally challenged most days of the week.
I would still appreciate
yeah,
hearing
yeah,
your
I would
thoughts,
too.
yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, so one of the things I do is I don't prevent development. I think development is important for every town and city. If you don't have development, you have a lot of old houses that look pretty bad. I own some of those because I spend my money on other things, like the inside of the house. But what I find is in Portsmouth, there are a lot of incentives that really favor development. And that happened because years ago, we had a lot of houses that needed work. And so we wanted development to come in and to spend their money. But now people want to build here because it's very profitable for them. No matter what they build, they're making money in the end. So I think some of those things should be changed. So what I look at is, for example, building height. There's always number 10582122C always becomes a topic of conversation with all of these, and one of the ones I'm working on, this is a big topic. But it more or less allows them to get bigger. But they get to double dip in the sense of if they're in the incentive districts, which is on the last page. So I did them in order the way they are in the book, but really it's not how they work. The incentives allow for a lot of things that involve big growth. but it does not encourage any affordable housing. So if you provide a big sidewalk, or you provide some community space, you get to double dip in the height and the minimum footprint. So if you look back to the middle page, 5828, you see that 30% of the property is assigned as community space, and that counts towards your open space. But then if you go to the incentives, you also get to count that same thing as your open space, so you get building height as well. So you get width and height for the same space. And in the case of, what's on my other sheet, but in the case of different developments, I think it's 25% open space in CD L1 and L2, and in CD 4, I believe it's 10%, and in CD5, I think it's 5%. I would have to look those up. I wrote them down, but I don't have them with me. And the reason I bring that up is because if you're double dipping, you're just getting more space for the same community space. Some of these community spaces are in the wetlands where they couldn't build to begin with, but we're given them a height incentive and a footprint incentive. And in my world, you could get one, either the height or the width, but the other one would require you to provide affordable housing, or whatever you want to call it. And the reason I like that idea is because it's great to have a lot of fancy condos, but they showed through Osprey Landing, which where Seacrest Village used to be, if you've lived here a long time, Seacrest Village was a lot of low-income housing together in one spot. And what they did is they divided it up, and when you drive through there, you can't really tell the difference between the low-income housing and the affordable housing, and the other people who have condos. So to me, that seems to be the right way to do it, as opposed to creating buildings full of people of the same financial situation. So I think we do need some houses that are like for seniors or whatever, but I also think that we need to integrate affordable, or whatever you want to call it, there's always a good political name for it, along with the people who are more well-to-do. I guess that would be a nice way to say it. So you can have $1 million condo, and right next door you can have the guy who works in the restaurant downstairs. And I think that's one of the problems that I see in Portsmouth, is that it's become a lot of well-to-do people, and I think that's great because they really help the economy. I'd like to pretend like I'm one of them, but I have too many apartments to be one of those people. Maybe if I sold them now, it would be great. But the other thing is, too, is that those of us who have been the backbone, the small family-owned rental units, are having to raise our rent in order to be able to survive now, because what used to cost me $300 for a washing machine is now $500. What used to cost me for a contractor come in has literally tripled. So any work that gets done is more expensive, so now we've had to raise our rents. So to be able to do that, you have to have a balance, and I don't think our zoning really balances that. When this zoning was put into place, we wanted people to come here and build. And now people want here to come here to build because they make a fortune. You know, you can sell a condo for $1 million down on the waterfront that when I moved here, you wouldn't walk there by yourself on a Friday night. So there's a good piece to that and a bad piece, and we need to look at the zoning very carefully because of that. So those are kind of my zoning. And there's a lot more. I haven't even looked at Gateway, since most of the buildings that I am interested in that affect the neighborhood that I have property in are in in the CD zones, not in the Gateway. So those are the zoning ordinances I know the best. But there's more, but I didn't go through the whole book. I didn't have time. So that's my story.
I'll make sure this gets to the next group as well.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank you so
There's a
much,
lot of
Liz.
insight in what you just said. I appreciate your comments.
Thank you. When does the other group meet, though?
April
8th
8th.
at 8:30.
Don't trust.
8:30.
8:30, now that I know
it's-
everyone can make it, I will send that out.
Very
And,
true.
and it's such the truth that what you just said is, I feel like pretty much everyone has the same sentiment, that a lot of these,
Are not
to the
working.
counselor's point, why she wanted to create this commission and committee, is that we need to update these. These were written when we were a town that as I joke that, you know, in the 80s, my grandparents moved out of Portsmouth because they didn't want, you know, to raise their, you know what I mean? They didn't feel safe. And now we are a desirable community, and now developers are gonna build here no matter what. And now we, you know, can be put back into the driver's seat of that track.
I know you're not a planner, but I think that what you just said about really integrating and that really is an outcome that we have over the years where we've had, that's the section of town where all this subsidized, and this is the section where that has led to outcomes that are inequitable and that are unsustainable and basically cultivate a culture of poverty in some ways. And I don't think that could ever happen in Portsmouth, but on its basic level, the idea of integrating housing throughout the community, it's like the rising tide lifts all ships, and it's a very good principle. So if we did use fee in lieu at some point, it would not be a universal. There'd be certain conditions that it would have to meet, because it's a valuable tool to say you don't have to provide affordable housing, you can pay into a fund instead, but we would have to think about how we would use that, because it's, as you've mentioned before, that integrated outcome is really the outcome that leads to overall better community outcomes. So.
I think Osprey Landon is a great example, but I would say, no, please, this is great.
It was very well put, yeah.
You know, I constantly always talk about Atlantic Heights.
Yeah.
Right, and how our zone in now, you could never build that.
Yeah.
Where we have the multiple roads, we have some singles, we have some duplexes, and so how do we look at some of these zones and say, we would have planned this, prove that we would do this, and then it does create more of that feel that takes down the height, takes down, you know, the larger mass buildings, and recreate that. And then we do, though, have some places, you know, that people do talk about them on the outskirts. Gosling Meadows, we would say, is one of them. Although they are upkept, they are good. It does in your mind when you talk to people about it. That's low income housing. They constantly think about that. When you look at Offspring, you don't necessarily think that, even though there is low income housing in there. And so I think, you know, figuring out how we can use this committee to copy those incentives in other areas is why I think we're all here.
I think the other thing I'd add is if you look at Atlantic Heights or even Panaway Manor,
Yeah.
to some extent, both of those tracks were developed with workforce in mind. Atlantic Heights to support shipbuilding, Panaway Manor to support, you know, manufacturing. So I think Portsmouth has a history of developing tracts of land to support workforce, and this is our opportunity to do the same here.
That's what McDonough Street was.
Yeah.
Then it turned into the worst place you could live.
Hey.
I bought them.
Because I lived there.
I know. But you moved in way after that.
2002.
We cleaned it up for you, and then you moved in. I do agree that there were tracts of housing that were built for specific people, and you can see that throughout history. But I think to mix them up is really the best way to go, because it allows people to see what they could do. And that a lot of times I think people forget that I lived in the lowest income bracket when I moved here, and we went up all the way to the highest income bracket, and now we're back in the middle. And it's doable for anybody if they have the courage to work 80 hours a week for long periods of time doing things they don't necessarily like. But to at least be able to expose people to opportunities, I think is really important. So,
Thank you very much.
you're welcome.
Are there any other members of the public? I know I see a couple of people online that wish to speak. Just raise your hand. No one appears to be raising their hand, so I'll give it another few seconds. But if that is it, then I would say we call adjournment, and you all have your tasks in front of you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
When the meetings are coming up.
I'm still trying to schedule them, but yes, so,
So this one was listed on the.
you know, I need an assistant. I need a,
I got my next meeting. Thank you.
All right.
bye. I truly need my own assistant to help me with all these things.
Not the truth.